Let me tell you about the day humanity proved that common sense is apparently not a universal constant. It started with Ms. Rodriguez, a fifth-grade teacher from Nebraska who had the brilliant idea that taking a field trip to an active war zone would be, and I quote, character building for the children. Now, most species in the galaxy would hear this suggestion and immediately check Ms. Rodriguez into the nearest psychiatric facility. But humans? Oh no. Humans looked at this idea and said, you know what? That sounds educational. The Galactic Education Board, bless their naive little alien hearts, had been trying for years to figure out human educational methods. After all, humans kept producing scientists, engineers, and diplomats who could somehow negotiate peace treaties while simultaneously inventing weapons of mass destruction and new flavors of ice cream. So when Ms. Rodriguez submitted her field trip proposal titled Experiential Learning in Contemporary Conflict Zones, they stamped it approved faster than you could say, liability waiver. Standing on the departure platform of Earth Station 7, Ms. Rodriguez bounced on her toes with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for lottery winners or people who just discovered coffee. She wore a bright yellow sundress covered in cartoon rockets and held a clipboard that she consulted with religious devotion. All right, class, she chirped, addressing the most diverse group of 12-year-olds in galactic history. Remember, we're cultural ambassadors today. I want everyone to use their inside voices, keep their tentacles to themselves, and absolutely no phase shifting during the presentation. The human kids in the group, all 6 of them, were practically vibrating with excitement. Not because they were about to witness the horrors of war, mind you, but because they were missing Mrs. Peterson's algebra quiz. Tommy Martinez had even brought his gaming tablet, apparently under the impression that active combat zones came with Wi-Fi. The alien students, however, looked like they were attending their own funeral. Zixtil, a young crystalline whose species hadn't experienced conflict for over 3,000 years, kept asking his translator device if there was still time to transfer to pottery class, or interpretive dance, or literally anything else 101. This is highly irregular, muttered Quax from behind his breathing apparatus. His species, the Vorthan, were known for their logical approach to everything, which is probably why he kept calculating survival probabilities on his datapad and whimpering softly at the results. Commander Vextal of the rescue ship Inevitable Regret had been assigned as their escort, and he was handling the situation about as well as you'd expect from someone whose job description had suddenly expanded to include babysitting during war crimes. His species, the Cadron, were professional soldiers who took their duties seriously, which made his current assignment feel like some kind of cosmic joke. Let me understand this correctly, Vextal said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd given up on the universe making sense. You want to take children, actual offspring, not just small adults, into an active combat zone for education. That's right, Miss Rodriguez beamed. The curriculum standards clearly state that students should experience diverse perspectives on conflict resolution. What better way than first-hand observation? Principal Henderson, who had flown up from Earth specifically to see them off, nodded approvingly. Kids these days spend too much time with their noses buried in virtual reality simulations. They need real-world experience. Build some character. Back in my day, we walked uphill both ways to school through actual minefield. This was, of course, complete nonsense, since Principal Henderson had grown up in suburban Ohio, but humans have this remarkable ability to rewrite their personal histories when it serves their point. Commander Vextal's mandibles clicked in what his species did instead of sighing. And you have permission from the parents for this educational experience? Oh yes, Ms. Rodriguez said, waving a stack of forms. Full permission slips. Although I did have to explain to the Zephyrian parents that war zone wasn't a mistranslation. They thought we were visiting a warm zone, like a tropical planet. Sweet of them to pack sunscreen for little Kriya. Kriya, the Zephyrian student in question, had indeed been slathered in SPF 50 and was wearing tiny sunglasses. Her species resembled earth dolphins, if dolphins had opposable thumbs and an instinctive fear of loud noises. She was currently trying to hide behind Tommy Martinez, who was half her size but seemed completely unconcerned about their destination. Military command is going to have my shell for this, Vextal muttered. Now, Commander, Principal Henderson said, clapping him on what passed for a shoulder. What's the worst that could happen? And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the moment the universe decided to take that question as a personal challenge. 3 hours later, their transport ship descended through the atmosphere of planet Crixmore, which looked exactly like you'd expect a war-torn planet to look. Smoke plumes rose from the surface like birthday candles on a cake that nobody wanted to celebrate, and the occasional flash of weapons fire lit up the landscape in what Ms. Rodriguez would probably describe as atmospheric mood lighting. The pilot, a grizzled Terran named Captain Murphy, who'd clearly drawn the short straw in life, announced over the intercom. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted other classifications, welcome to Crixmore, where the weather is explosive and the locals are unfriendly. Current ground temperature is 72 degrees with a 90% chance of getting shot at. Please keep your arms, tentacles, and pseudopods inside the vehicle until we reach the designated landing zone, assuming it still exists." Through the viewport, the students could see two distinct armies shooting at each other across what used to be a major city. The architecture was that particular style of recently bombed that was becoming increasingly popular in this sector of the galaxy. The alien students immediately began what could generously be called tactical cowering. Zixtel had somehow managed to compress himself into a crystalline ball roughly the size of a marble. Quax was hyperventilating into his breathing apparatus so hard that it was fogging up. Little Kriya was making high-pitched whistling sounds that her species made when extremely distressed, which sounded like someone letting air out of a balloon very, very slowly. The human kids, meanwhile, had their faces pressed against the windows like they were at a theme park. "Oh, cool. Look at the size of those explosions," Tommy Martinez said, pulling out his tablet to record everything. "My dad's gonna be so jealous," added Emma Sullivan, a redhead whose greatest previous adventure had been getting lost in a corn maze. "Wait, is that guy on fire? Can we get a better angle?" Ms. Rodriguez was consulting her lesson plan with the dedication of someone who refused to let a little thing like mortal peril interfere with education. "Now, class, remember our discussion about conflict resolution strategies. Can anyone identify what type of dispute resolution we're observing?" Ooh, I know!" Emma raised her hand enthusiastically. "It's the shooty kind." "Very good, Emma. The term is kinetic diplomacy, but you're on the right track." Captain Murphy's voice crackled over the intercom again. Folks, we've got a slight problem. Our designated landing zone is currently occupied by what appears to be a very enthusiastic artillery duel. I'm gonna have to set us down in the middle of the battlefield and hope nobody mistakes us for a legitimate military target." Commander Vextall, who had spent the entire trip reviewing emergency evacuation procedures, finally spoke up. "This is insane. We should abort the mission immediately." "Nonsense," Ms. Rodriguez said cheerfully. "This is a perfect learning opportunity. How often do students get to observe live case studies in interspecies communication breakdown?" The ship touched down with a gentle thud, immediately followed by a less gentle explosion somewhere nearby that rattled everyone's teeth. Through the walls they could hear the distinct sounds of a firefight in progress. Energy weapons charging, projectile weapons firing, and someone screaming what sounded like very creative profanity in at least 3 languages. Captain Murphy opened the cargo bay door, and immediately a smoking piece of debris flew past the entrance. "Well, there's your red carpet, folks. Try not to die immediately. I've got a reputation to maintain." Ms. Rodriguez gathered her students, completely ignoring the fact that the air outside smelled like ozone and burning metal. "Remember, class, we're here to observe and learn. Please stay with the group, don't touch anything that's glowing or making suspicious sounds, and if anyone offers you weapons, politely decline unless it's for educational purposes." The human kids bounded off the ship like puppies at a dog park. The alien students had to be physically carried by Commander Vextall, who was beginning to suspect this was some kind of elaborate punishment for something he'd done in a past life. The first person they encountered was General Tok'Run of the Crixmore Defense Force, a 7-foot-tall insectoid who'd been coordinating the defense of this particular crater when a civilian transport ship had inexplicably landed in the middle of his battlefield. He approached their group with the bewildered expression of someone whose day had just taken a turn for the surreal. "Who are you people?" General Tok'Run demanded, his compound eyes taking in the sight of small beings in bright clothing standing around casually while explosions went off in the background. "This is an active combat zone. You need to evacuate immediately." "Oh, hello," Ms. Rodriguez said, extending her hand for a handshake as if they were meeting at a parent-teacher conference. "I'm Ms. Rodriguez, and this is my 5th grade class from the Galactic Education Consortium. We're here for a field trip. I have all the proper permits." She began digging through her purse, which apparently contained enough supplies to survive a small apocalypse. Out came permission slips, emergency contact forms, first aid supplies, juice boxes, string cheese, and what appeared to be a full medical kit. General Tok'Run stared at the scene before him. A human female unpacking snacks while his soldiers ducked incoming fire, small alien beings hiding behind anything they could find, and human children who seemed to think the ongoing battle was the most interesting thing they'd ever seen. Field trip, he repeated slowly, as if saying the words carefully might make them make more sense. You brought children to a war zone for education. That's right, Ms. Rodriguez beamed, pulling out a thermos of coffee. Would you like some coffee, General? You look stressed. It's decaf, very soothing. Somewhere in the distance, an explosion shook the ground hard enough to knock everyone except the humans off balance. The human kids just looked around with interest, while Tommy started taking notes in a composition book labeled My Summer Vacation. General Thakroon accepted the coffee with the stunned expression of someone whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally challenged. And that was before things got really weird. Now, what happened next is the kind of thing that makes military historians drink heavily and question their career choices. Because while General Thakroon was trying to process the concept of caffeinated beverages being served during active combat, the human children had noticed something that apparently nobody else had bothered to pay attention to. Hey, those guys over there look hungry, Em observed, pointing toward the enemy trenches where the Zektari Liberation Front was currently pinned down by suppressing fire. Oh, you're absolutely right, Emma, Ms. Rodriguez said, as if this was a perfectly normal classroom observation. Class, what do we do when we see people who might be hungry? Share our snacks, the human kids chorused, already digging into their backpacks. Commander Vextal, who had been trying to establish a secure perimeter, nearly tripped over his own feet. Wait, what are you doing? But it was too late. Tommy Martinez was already jogging across the battlefield, ducking under laser fire with the casual ease of someone avoiding raindrops, carrying a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a juice box. Behind him, Emma was following, with what appeared to be homemade cookies wrapped in foil. Tommy, use your outdoor voice so they can hear you, Ms. Rodriguez called out helpfully, and remember to introduce yourself first. The Zektari Liberation Front, who had been preparing to launch another assault, suddenly found themselves face to face with a 12-year-old human boy holding food. Hi, Tommy said cheerfully to a battle-scarred alien warrior who was pointing a plasma rifle at his head. I'm Tommy. My mom packed extra sandwiches. Want one? It's peanut butter and grape jelly. The jelly's the good kind, not that generic stuff. The warrior, whose name was actually Krektus the Bone Crusher, stared down at this tiny being who had somehow crossed a battlefield during active combat to offer him lunch. Krektus had been fighting this war for 3 years. He had seen terrible things. He had done terrible things. He had not, however, ever encountered peanut butter. Is this food? Krektus asked, his translator struggling with the concept of grape jelly. Try it. It's really good. My mom makes the best sandwiches in Nebraska. And because the universe has a twisted sense of humor, Krektus the Bone Crusher took a bite. Now here's something they don't teach you in military academy. When you give a professional soldier who's been living on military rations for 3 years a sandwich made with love by someone's mom, something magical happens. Krektus sat down heavily on a piece of rubble, still holding Tommy's sandwich, and for the first time in months he remembered what food was supposed to taste like. This is incredible, he whispered, taking another bite. By this point, Emma had arrived with the cookies, and 3 more Zektari soldiers had emerged from their positions, drawn by the smell of actual food and the surreal sight of their most feared warrior sharing snacks with a human child. Meanwhile, back at the command post, General Thokron was having what could generously be called a complete mental breakdown. They're fraternizing with the enemy, he shouted at Commander Vextal, during active combat, with snacks. Technically, Ms. Rodriguez said, consulting her notes, they're engaging in impromptu cultural exchange, which is encouraged by the Galactic Education Guidelines Section 47-C. The situation became even more surreal when Ms. Rodriguez noticed that some of the soldiers on both sides were getting a bit too aggressive for her liking. She walked directly into no man's land, clapped her hands twice, and used what educators everywhere recognize as the voice. Excuse me, gentlemen. I need everyone to take a step back and use their inside voices. This is getting entirely too rowdy. The battlefield went silent, not because of some cosmic intervention, but because every sentient being within earshot had been programmed by evolution to respond to that particular tone of voice. It was the sound of maternal authority, and it cut through species barriers like a hot knife through butter. A Krixmore soldier who had been about to throw a grenade slowly lowered his arm. A Zektari sniper found himself sitting down for no reason he could explain. Even General Thakron felt a sudden urge to straighten his uniform and apologize for things he hadn't done. Now then, Ms. Rodriguez continued, I can see that everyone is very excited, but we need to remember our conflict resolution skills. When we have disagreements, what do we do first? The aliens stared at her in confusion. The human kids, however, knew this routine. We use our words, they shouted back. That's right, we use our words. Now, can someone please explain to me what this argument is about? And that's when things got really interesting, because nobody could actually remember. General Tokran opened his mouth to explain about territorial disputes and resource allocation, but found himself struggling to articulate exactly why they'd been shooting at each other for 3 years. Commander Zixnell, of the Liberation Front, tried to explain their grievances, but when he got to the part about trade route access, he realized it sounded kind of silly when you said it out loud in front of children. Meanwhile, Tommy had made friends with half the Zekthari unit, Emma was teaching alien soldiers how to make friendship bracelets out of paracord, and the other human kids had somehow organized an impromptu first aid station, using the contents of Ms. Rodriguez's purse. My tummy hurts, announced a massive alien warrior, approaching little Emma Sullivan. Ah, that's okay, Emma said, digging through the first aid kit. My mom always says Band-Aids make everything better. Here, this one has cartoon puppies on it. She stuck a Band-Aid on the warrior's armor, right over where he claimed his stomach was hurting. The warrior looked down at the tiny adhesive strip with cartoon puppies, looked back at Emma, and smiled for the first time in months. It does feel better, he admitted. Within an hour, there was a line of alien soldiers waiting to receive Band-Aids with cartoon characters, not because they were injured, but because apparently the psychological effect of someone caring enough to put a colorful sticker on your boo-boo is universal. Commander Vextal found himself standing next to General Thokran, both of them watching human children provide medical care and snacks to soldiers from both sides of an active war zone. This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen, Vextal said. Completely absurd, Thokran agreed. It's working, though. Unfortunately, yes. And that was the moment they realized that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their tactics. It was their absolute refusal to let a little thing like common sense get in the way of being aggressively friendly. Now, you might think that having an impromptu snack break in the middle of a war zone would be the weirdest part of this story. You would be wrong. Because that's when little Jamie Peterson, the quietest kid in the class, raised her hand and asked the question that changed everything. Ms. Rodriguez, why are these people fighting? Mr. Rodriguez, who had been organizing the friendship bracelet supplies, looked up with interest. That's an excellent question, Jamie. Gentlemen? She turned to General Thokran and Commander Zixnall with the expectant look of someone who genuinely wanted to know the answer. The two military leaders exchanged glances. They'd been shooting at each other for so long that the original cause had become somewhat abstract. Well, General Thokran began, it's about the trade routes through the Nexus system. They want to control them. No, Commander Zixnell protested. You want to control them. We just want fair access, like the treaty promised. What treaty? Tommy asked, looking up from where he was teaching a Zekthari soldier how to make paper airplanes. The treaty of General Togan paused, his compound eyes widening slightly. The Treaty of Kesmar, Commander Zixnell supplied. The one that gave us equal access to the trade routes. Right. That treaty. The one that clearly states that the routes would be jointly administered. There was a long pause. Wait, Commander Zixnell said slowly. You mean the treaty that gives us joint administration of the trade routes? Yes, that's the one I'm talking about. The treaty that says we jointly administer the trade routes. Another pause, this one significantly longer. Emma Sullivan, who had been listening while applying cartoon Band-Aids to wounded soldiers, spoke up. So you're both supposed to share the space roads? That's correct, both commanders said simultaneously. But you've been fighting about who gets to control them? Yes. Even though the treaty says you're supposed to share? Well, when you put it like that, Jamie Peterson, having started this line of inquiry, pressed on with the relentless logic that only children possess. Did anyone actually read the treaty? The silence that followed was the kind of silence that makes historians weep and philosophers question the nature of reality. It was broken by Ms. Rodriguez, who had that tone in her voice that teachers get when they've discovered something deeply troubling about their students' homework. Gentlemen, please tell me that someone, somewhere, has a copy of this treaty. More silence. Anyone at all? Commander Vextal, who had been watching this conversation unfold with growing horror, finally spoke. You've been fighting a 3-year war over a treaty that none of you have actually read? We have summaries, General Thokran said defensively. Written by whom? Our respective legal departments. Who got their information from where? The pause that followed was so profound that even the ongoing explosions in the distance seemed to respect it. Oh, for crying out loud, Ms. Rodriguez said, digging into her bag again. This woman apparently carried everything short of a small nuclear reactor in there. Does anyone have access to the Galactic Treaty database? Tommy pulled out his tablet. I've got Wi-Fi. Want me to look it up? Please do, honey. While Tommy worked his technological magic, Emma had organized the soldiers into a circle and was leading them through what appeared to be a modified version of Duck Duck Goose. Watching battle-hardened warriors giggle as they chased each other around in a circle was either the most heartwarming or most disturbing thing Commander Vextol had ever seen. Possibly both. Found it, Tommy announced. The Treaty of Kesmar, signed 15 years ago between the Krixmar Republic and the Zektari Federation. Section 12, Paragraph 47. Trade route administration shall be conducted jointly by both parties, with equal representation and shared oversight of all commercial activities passing through designated space lanes. He looked up from his tablet with the satisfied expression of someone who just solved a puzzle. It says right here that you're supposed to work together. There's even a whole section about setting up a joint committee and having meetings every month. General Thuk-Run and Commander Zixnal stared at each other across the battlefield that had been their home for 3 years. Joint committee, General Thuk-Run repeated. Monthly meetings, Commander Zixnal added. We could have been having meetings this whole time instead of shooting at each other. With coffee and those little pastries from the good bakery on Station 7. Oh, I love those pastries. Mrs. Rodriguez, sensing an educational opportunity, clapped her hands together. Well then, this sounds like a perfect case study in communication breakdown. Class, what have we learned about the importance of reading source materials before making important decisions? The human kids who had been watching this revelation unfold chorused back. Always check your facts. And what do we do when we have disagreements with our friends? Talk it out. Excellent. Now, gentlemen, I think this would be a perfect opportunity for some conflict resolution practice. Why don't we set up a proper meeting right here? And that's how a 5th grade teacher from Nebraska ended up mediating peace negotiations between 2 alien militaries, using techniques she'd learned from handling playground disputes. She had them sit in a circle, take turns speaking without interrupting, and use I feel statements instead of accusations. I feel frustrated when I think you're trying to cut us out of the trade routes, General Thuk-Run said, following Ms. Rodriguez's guidance. I feel worried that you don't trust us to honor the treaty, Commander Zixnal replied. I feel like we might have been overthinking this whole situation, they both said at the same time. Commander Vextol watched this surreal scene unfold and had what he would later describe as an existential crisis. 3 years of brutal warfare, thousands of casualties, billions of credits in military spending, and the solution had been a 12-year-old with a tablet and a teacher with conflict resolution training. This is insane, he muttered to himself. But it's working, pointed out Captain Murphy, who had wandered over to see what all the fuss was about. That's what makes it insane. And he wasn't wrong, because while the adults had been busy making everything complicated, the humans had done what humans do best. They'd looked at a problem, ignored all the reasons why it couldn't be solved, and solved it anyway. What happened next is the kind of thing that gets filed under classified too weird for public consumption in military archives across the galaxy. Ms. Rodriguez, having successfully mediated the preliminary peace talks, decided that what this historic moment needed was proper documentation. She pulled out a stack of construction paper from her seemingly infinite bag of supplies and handed out crayons to both military commanders. Now then, gentlemen, let's make this official. I want you both to write down your agreements in your own words, use your best handwriting, and remember to stay inside the lines. General Thuk-Run, a decorated war hero with over 40 years of military service, found himself holding a purple crayon and trying to remember how to write neatly. This seemed somewhat informal for a peace treaty. Honey, the most important documents in human history were written on whatever was handy at the time. The Magna Carta was written on sheepskin, the Declaration of Independence on hemp paper, and my grocery lists are written on whatever napkin I can find in my purse. It's not about the paper, it's about the intention. Commander Zixnal was already hard at work with a green crayon, his tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. Should I draw pictures to illustrate the main points? That's an excellent idea. Visual aids always help with comprehension. 20 minutes later, the Treaty of Krixmar Reconciliation was complete. Written in crayon on construction paper and illustrated with stick figures of aliens shaking hands around what appeared to be a space station shaped like a donut. It was probably the most informal international agreement in galactic history, and definitely the most colorful. But here's the thing about humans. They don't just solve problems and walk away. Oh no. They solve problems and then they throw a party. All right, class, Ms. Rodriguez announced. Since we're here for cultural exchange, why don't we organize a proper celebration? Emma, did you bring those cookies from the bake sale? Emma brightened. I brought 3 dozen. Mom said to save some for later, but I think peace treaties count as special occasions. Within an hour, the former battlefield had been transformed into what could only be described as the galaxy's most bizarre cultural festival. Human kids were teaching alien soldiers playground games. Cractus the Bone Crusher had somehow become the master of ceremonies for an impromptu talent show. Someone had rigged a portable speaker to play music from at least 6 different worlds simultaneously, creating a sound that was either beautifully multicultural or completely horrifying depending on your perspective. General Thokrin found himself participating in what the human children called red light, green light, a game which apparently involved running when someone said green light and freezing when they said red light. The sight of a 7-foot-tall insectoid military commander, frozen mid-stride because a 12-year-old human had yelled red light, was something that Commander Vextall knew would haunt his dreams for years to come. This is unprecedented, he muttered, watching as Commander Zixnall attempted to learn hopscotch from Jamie Peterson. Unprecedented good or unprecedented bad? Asked Captain Murphy, who had broken out a flask and was sharing something that smelled like rocket fuel with some of the off-duty soldiers. I honestly don't know anymore. The alien students who had spent the entire day hiding behind various pieces of debris finally began to emerge as they realized that the battlefield had somehow transformed into the safest place in the galaxy. Zixtel had uncompressed himself from his crystalline ball form and was cautiously approaching the cookie table. Quax had stopped hyperventilating and was actually taking notes on human behavior patterns. Little Kriya was teaching some Zektari soldiers how to whistle, which was creating a sound like a very confused wind chime. But the real moment of revelation came when General Thok-Run, who had been sampling Emma's cookies, sat down next to Commander Zixnall during a break in the festivities. You know, he said thoughtfully, this is the most fun I've had in years. Same here, Zixnall replied, watching Tommy Martinez attempt to teach a group of soldiers how to do cartwheels. When did warfare become so boring? Probably around the time we forgot why we were fighting. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching human children turn hardened warriors into giggling participants in playground games. We should have done this years ago, General Thokran mused. What, had a field trip interrupt our war? No, actually talk to each other. The humans make it look so easy. Commander Zixnall nodded toward where Ms. Rodriguez was patiently explaining the rules of tag to a group of confused alien soldiers. They're either the wisest species in the galaxy or the most dangerously naive. Probably both. The celebration continued until the sun began to set over Crexmoor, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that were actually quite beautiful when you weren't ducking incoming fire. As the day wound down, both armies began the surreal process of packing up their weapons while sharing contact information and making plans for the joint committee meetings that would apparently replace their shooting schedule. Ms. Rodriguez gathered her students, who looked like they'd had the best field trip in educational history. Even the alien kids were chattering excitedly about their day, though Quax was still calculating the statistical improbability of everything they'd witnessed. All right, class, time to head back to the ship. Did everyone remember to say thank you to our new friends? A chorus of thank you echoed across the former battlefield, followed by alien voices attempting to repeat the phrase in heavily accented English. General Thokran approached Ms. Rodriguez with something that might have been embarrassment if insects could feel embarrassed. Ms. Rodriguez, I want to thank you, not just for the peace treaty, but for reminding us what we were supposed to be fighting for in the first place. Oh, you're very welcome, General. That's what education is all about, helping people remember what's really important. She handed him a juice box and a friendship bracelet that Emma had made for him. Now you boys play nicely while we're gone, and remember to schedule those committee meetings. Communication is key. As they walked back to their transport, Commander Vextall shook his head in amazement. I'm going to have to file a report about this, and nobody is going to believe a word of it. That's okay, Ms. Rodriguez said cheerfully. The best learning experiences usually sound impossible when you try to explain them to other people. And with that, the most successful diplomatic mission in galactic history came to an end, leaving behind a peace treaty written in crayon and a battlefield covered in cookie crumbs and friendship bracelet materials. The journey back to Earth Station 7 was considerably quieter than the trip out, mainly because half the passengers were experiencing what psychologists call reality processing delays. The alien students had gone from cowering in terror to having the best day of their educational careers, while Commander Vextal spent the entire flight staring out the viewport and occasionally muttering things like cookie diplomacy and why didn't we try snacks sooner? Captain Murphy, ever the professional, made his final announcement as they approached the station. Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of various classifications, we have successfully completed what I can only describe as the weirdest mission of my 30-year career. Please ensure you have all your belongings, including any friendship bracelets, peace treaties, and existential crises you may have acquired during our visit. The debriefing session at Earth Station 7 was, predictably, a complete disaster from a bureaucratic standpoint. The Galactic Education Board had been expecting a routine field trip report. What they got instead was a detailed account of how a group of fifth graders had accidentally ended a 3-year war using playground diplomacy and baked goods. "Let me understand this correctly," said Board Director Kelvan, whose species prided themselves on logical thinking. "The students resolved a complex territorial dispute using conflict resolution techniques learned in elementary school?" "That's right," Ms. Rodriguez said proudly. "We covered sharing, taking turns, using our words instead of our fists, and the importance of reading instructions carefully. Basic life skills, really." And the peace treaty was written in crayon. Purple and green crayon with illustrations, very thorough documentation. Director Kelvan looked at the report again, as if reading it multiple times might make it make more sense. "And this actually worked?" "Oh yes, both sides have already scheduled their first joint committee meeting for next Thursday. They're going to meet at that nice cafe on Station 7, the one with the good pastries." The human students, meanwhile, were already planning their next adventure. Tommy Martinez was lobbying hard for a field trip to a black hole, arguing that if they could solve a war, they could probably figure out quantum mechanics too. Emma Sullivan wanted to visit a diplomatic summit to see if they were doing it right, compared to what they'd witnessed. Jamie Peterson, ever practical, just wanted to go somewhere with good snacks. The alien students were having their own processing issues. Zixtel had written a 17-page essay about human social dynamics that his professors would later frame and hang in the xenopsychology department. Quacks had calculated that the statistical probability of everything they'd witnessed was so low that it either proved humans were the luckiest species in the galaxy, or the universe had a very strange sense of humor. Priya was just happy she'd learned how to make friendship bracelets. Commander Vextal submitted his official report and immediately requested a transfer to the farthest, quietest corner of the galaxy he could find. His request was denied because, as his commanding officer pointed out, anyone who could survive a field trip with human children was clearly command material and would be promoted accordingly. General Thokron and Commander Zixnell became unlikely friends and co-authored a military strategy paper titled "Why We Should Have Just Talked," a retrospective analysis of unnecessary warfare. It became required reading at military academies across 3 star systems, though most cadets thought it was a work of fiction. And Ms. Rodriguez? Well, Ms. Rodriguez was already planning next year's field trip. She'd heard wonderful things about the educational opportunities available at the Galactic Council's headquarters, where apparently they'd been having some spirited discussions about trade regulations that had lasted for approximately 6 months with no resolution. "Think of the learning opportunities," she told Principal Henderson during their follow-up meeting. "Direct observation of interspecies diplomacy, hands-on experience with conflict mediation, and I heard they have excellent cafeteria facilities." Principal Henderson, who had spent the last week fielding calls from military officials, education boards, and news organizations, just nodded wearily. "Ms. Rodriguez, at this point I'm convinced you could accidentally solve galactic hunger if someone told you the food distribution centers were having organizational problems." "Oh, what a wonderful idea. Do you think they'd be interested in a field trip?" And somewhere in the depths of space, the universe itself seemed to chuckle, because if there's one thing humanity had proven beyond all doubt, it's that the most complex problems often have the simplest solutions. You just need to be brave enough, or possibly naive enough, to ignore all the reasons why those solutions shouldn't work. After all, sometimes the best way to end a war is to pack a lunch, bring some band-aids, and treat everyone like they're just people who forgot how to use their words.